Video essay assignment, March 2020, editing for film and TV, BIFE. The film editor starts as soon as the first scenes have been recorded, cataloguing and cutting raw footage to construct a sequence of images and sound, a very unique art of cinema, where the editor assembles shots into a coherent sequence to capture the director's vision. The film editor works most closely with the director and with the cinematographer to maintain the style of the story, and collaborates with sound editors, special effects specialists, and can visit locations to get an idea of the shot. 7 typical skills and qualifications of an editor: Bachelor of Arts in Film and Television, some previous industry experience, a strong knowledge of editing tools, techniques and software, familiar with camera equipment, critical and analytical skills, great patience and concentration, organizational and time management skills. The day-to-day responsibilities an editor would have leading up to and during production: reading scripts to understand the vision of the director, visiting set locations during filming, and reviewing footage and selecting scenes and trimming footage. For the job of an editor isn't simply to mechanically put pieces of a film together, cut off film slates, or edit dialogue scenes. In The Art of Filmmaking by James D. Roke, a film editor must creatively work with the layers of images, story, dialogue, music, pacing, as well as the actors' performances, to effectively reimagine and even rewrite the film to craft a cohesive whole. Editors usually play a dynamic role in the making of a film. In a production context, in contemporary editing, in a big-budget film, as an example, an editor would have to use more rudimentary equipment to color grade image sequences that do not suit the film's tone. By using a punch card system that records the preferred color grade selected by the editor, where he punches in the requirements, this punch card would contain the editing list segments, which would have each film frame number recorded on each punch card. This would then be sent to the developing lab, where they would redevelop the film with the new color grade settings, i.e. by individually changing the lighting during exposure. In contrast, in a small budget film, this would simply be not cost effective, and the editing process would be more focused with cutting. With the advent of digital editing, film editors and their assistants have become responsible for many areas of filmmaking that is used to be responsibility of others. For instance, in past years, picture editors dealt only with just that picture. Sound, music, and more recently visual effects editors dealt with the practicalities of other aspects of editing processes, usually under the direction of picture editor and director. However, digital systems have increasingly put these responsibilities on the picture editor. It is common, especially in lower budget films, for the assistant editors or even the editor to cut in music, mock up visual effects, and add sound effects or other sound replacements. These temporary elements are usually replaced with more refined final elements by the sound, music, and visual effects teams hired to complete the picture. As you can see on the screen, the complex process flow involved in modern editing using systems such as Avid or Final Pro. In the golden age, initial editing was done with a positive copy of the film negative, which was called a work print, or a cutting copy. This was then cut and pasted on a machine such as a Moviola, or a flatbed machine such as a Steenbeck. When the film work print had been cut, it was then used to make an edit decision list, an EDL. As I mentioned, the EDL was used to change the color grading in the olden days, but the negative cutter also used this list to process the negative, splitting the shots into rolls, which were then contact printed to produce the final film print, called the answer print. There are 3 main editing stages, and the editor's cut is the first. Also called the assembly edit or rough cut, starts when principal photography starts. The editor and director discuss dailies, which are raw footage shot each day, as the shooting progresses. The second stage is the director's cut. When shooting is finished, the director can turn his full attention to collaborating with the editor and further refining the cut of the film. The final stage is the final cut. Often after the director has had his chance to oversee a cut, the subsequent cuts are supervised by one or more producers who represent a production company and are a movie studio. Editors can even express themselves through their unique styles. Spike Lee's films feel fast, lean, and alive with momentum. Lee's editor of 30 years is a big reason for that. Barry Alexander Brown, approach towards BlacKkKlansman calls it getting rid of the business. An example of a scene in BlacKkKlansman where undercover officer Flip Zimmerman lights a cigarette for KK member Walter. Another style is hip-hop montage, which is a subset of fast cutting used in film to portray a complex action, through a rapid series of simple actions in fast motion, which is accompanied by sound effects. The technique was first given its name by Darren Aronofsky, who used the technique in his films P.I. and Requiem for a Dream. Edgar Wright has made fast cuts his style, similar in style to Aronofsky's Requiem. His work is energetic and quirky and often parodises genre, making light of zombies in Shaun of the Dead or making light of the action hero fantasy in Hot Fuzz. Edgar Wright is prolific in quick cut montages of characters tuning up for an action scene, or to super stylized mundane events, sometimes to comedic effect, such as in Hot Fuzz when in reverse effect the crime scene is sealed in seconds and then we cut back to the humdrum traffic duty. Wright enjoys cutting in action moments to get through a sequence and then cut to the next scene. In Baby Driver, he does not seem to use this technique, but if we watch very closely, we can see that every time a character interacts with an inanimate object, there is a quick close-up. The editing in Edgar Wright's Baby Driver is closer to the editing made in modern music videos than film. The movie is heavily influenced by soundtrack. Every piece of action is built around the chosen song. Wright reveres the film and filmmakers of genres he mocks. To get the parody of Hot Fuzz pitch perfect, Wright and Pegg watched over 138 action films and talked to scores of real policemen. When choosing the type of cut to use at any given time, your decision will depend on 4 things: genre, length, style, and pacing. An action film, for example, will have very fast cuts during the violent scenes. A drama will have a very slow pacing of shots and cut. As an introduction, I will briefly take note of the chronology of editing through time. The classical editing is from The Porter's The Great Train Robbery, 1903, through to the Golden Age of Hollywood. Post-classical editing is from 1960 onwards, and MTV editing is from 1980 onwards. These are distinguished by the shot length in films, which have reduced from 8 to 11 seconds in classical Hollywood to only 5 to 8 seconds in post-classical, and as small as 3 to 4 seconds in post-1980 MTV style editing. I guess I should begin with classical editing. Porter established continuity editing by telling a story in continuity form. In his film The Life of an American Fireman in 1902, where he took the archived sequences and combined stock footage from Edison to create a cinematic form and film narrative. It was the first cinematic example of cross-cutting, showing 7 shots of the interior of the burning building and 6 shots of the exterior of the same burning building. In this primitive film era, the audience's ability to perceive the sense of time and space and narrative of a story was also wrongly perceived and misunderstood. However, Porter did realize that the cinematic narrative depended not so much on the arrangement of the props and actors in a scene, like in theater, as upon the arrangement of shots in relation to one another. D.W. Griffith was an actor turned director. They challenged the notion that the audience were merely passive spectators. Using the many tools and conventions from Porter to Malise, he began to explore temporal and spatial lengths he could generate from the position of his film camera. Griffith explored cutting long shots, full shots, medium shots, close shots, in order to render and evoke an emotion from both his audience, and also to render and create a dramatic scene, and to create a film language within a scene, and finally, the extreme long shot for battle scenes. By changing shots, he could enrich the language of the sequence of pictures. An angry man in one full shot, and the shocked reaction of another character in a second medium close shot. Griffith seemed in touch with his audience, and in his film After Many Years, before the release of the film, he was criticized for using parallel editing without an action scene. "How can you tell a story jumping about like that?" "Like a Dickens novel," replied Griffith, "except with picture stories." Films were narratives, through the arrangement not of words, but of moving photographic images. And Griffith seemed to understand this, and he understood his audience's ability to also understand. To the critics' astonishment, the film, After Many Years, was hailed a masterpiece. It is worth noting that Griffith's film in 1909, A Corner in Wheat, used parallel editing where he cut from a shot of the wealthy wheat tycoon gorging himself at a lavish meal, to a shot of the poor farm workers standing in a bread line, which has predated the associate montage era that came about from Einstein's montage of attractions. This is a very interesting intellectual development that Griffith was innovative and intuitive and created within his own film experimentation. The Soviet montage came about in large part from Sergei Eisenstein's montage of attractions, units of impression combined into a whole, which he used in theater in Russia in the 1920s. He drew his concept from the Kuleshov effect. Kuleshov realized the juxtaposition of two shots created meaning not apparent when viewed individually. The shot in a film always has two values, he reasoned. The one it carries in itself as a photographic image of reality, and the one it acquires when placed into a juxtaposition with another shot. Kuleshov reasoned further that the second value is more important. Griffith naturally understood this intuitively, and this style was apparently already apparent in his films. But Kuleshov gave this principle theoretical articulation. The montage is defining shots that are depictive, single in meaning, and neutral in content into intellectual context and series. As Sergei was a student of Kuleshov, it was natural he would develop and practice this theory further, which he experimented with in theater and eventually in film. Eisenstein studied haiku and the Japanese language and created dialectical montage. From this he derived the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis theorem as the basis for his dialectical montage. From my own brief study of Asian language, Chinese symbols can represent entire words, and when joined with other symbols create a pictorial associate character. Eisenstein's methods of metric, rhythmical, tonal, overtonal, and intellectual montage. Eisenstein's skill and experimentation in using fast-moving montage to produce telling metaphors and build and intensify sequences was not fully understood by the early Russian audiences. His rapid alternating images employed to emulate a machine gun fire and the cross-cutting with the crowd were not focused on the content of the image as much as they were to create the impression of chaos. Continuity editing, cutting according to the content of the shots. Rhythmic montage. Jess's step scene from Popped Minkin is emulated in many classical films. Typically, a comedy is brightly lit and a horror is darkly lit. The art direction in Raging Bro, where he's small amongst the ropes, is mise-en-scène, the light fading in the background as the figure looming bigger and stronger. This means overtonal montage is the intermixing of larger themes, whether political or religious, with the emotional tones of the piece.
Michael Francis Ritchie, do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
And all his works?
I do renounce them.
And all his poems?
I do renounce them.
Would you be baptized
I'll...
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti? Michael Rizzi, go in peace, and may the Lord be with you.
Hollywood style began with studio style, which is based on the mass production of film. Strict, cost-effective regimes, overlooked by iron-fisted moguls, would enforce an assembly line of film. They would produce more films per year than all of Europe combined. The mammoth, budget-driven, labor-intensive films created what is known as formalism, which is based loosely around the post-structuralism of the 50s, and before that was based on the Frankfurt theory. Hollywood saw that the condition for commercial development was to appeal to a mass audience, and had refined their target audience within the various strata of the bourgeoisie. Classical Hollywood used the Frankfurt theory of school as opposed to the magic bullet, and Lazarsfeld in 1944 created the two-step flow of communication, a model hypothesized that ideas flow from mass media to opinion leaders, and from them to a wider population. Katz built upon this model to create the user gratifications model in the late 1950s. Hollywood appealed to a form of mass culture, almost seducing people into accepting the values, attitudes, and fantasy presented to them. This new form of popular cinema could only reinforce in people a conventional way of making sense of the world, rather than inspiring them. The classic Hollywood style is formalist. In editing, it is the most influential in continuity of editing. In cinematic space and time, it is unified, continuous, and linear. The ununifying force behind the classical Hollywood style is motivation and conventions. And the classical Hollywood style follows a set of norms, paradigms, and standards that match and gratify viewers' expectations. This was the beginning of the star system, when Hollywood realized audiences connected emotionally with actors. They used convention of genre and the draw of stars, lighting, and editing. The medium of film was soon challenged by new mediums, such as television. In the midst of the golden age of Hollywood, television was to have a significant effect and was to change the medium of cinema. The language of film, the development of film semiotics, and the cinema code and function expectation in the backdrop of 1950s America's intellectual post-structuralism, cinema became hypermedia. Books and articles were being published in the 40s and 50s in Europe and the USA talking about individual Hollywood genre. Genre began to establish itself more, to become an academic, formal discipline in film studies. Theorists, critics, and teachers of film at this time wanted to engage in the appearance of genre and genre in particular, with popular Hollywood cinema offering a critical approach and a desire to displace or complement films. Popular genres and subgenres were popularized. Action and comedy. A subgenre of action could be action cop movies. A subgenre of action cop movies could be buddy cop. Hollywood films had always been discussed by reviewers and critics, usually hostile to the films Hollywood produced, arguing they aimed at mass market, conservative, commercially produced films, lacking in realism and overloaded in fantasy. As cinema evolved and the iron fist of the Big Five relented, we saw independent companies like BBS who brought a new style of editing with the iconic film Easy Rider. And fresh from NYU, Scorsese followed with his own independent production, Who's That Knocking at My Door? And 5 years later, Mean Streets. During the early 1970s, a generation of critics began to value elements of popular American culture, reassessing its value. And it was here the auteur theory began, more simply known as auteurism, based around three basic premises. Firstly, that cinema is a personal and individual expression. Second is that an individual could be the director, a figure equivalent to an artist. And thirdly was that cinematography authorship wasn't just to be found in Hollywood cinema. An auteur is a director whose work is characterized by distinctive elements and traits in their film, stamping each piece of work with their own personality. The criticism is that films are just personal expression of the director, Interpreting each film in the context of the filmmaker's style makes the director responsible for the major creative decisions. The concept of auteur theory is a crucial development in film theory, moving away from literary analysis of a film narrative's content to aspects of art and style specific in film. In Metaphors of Genre, the role of analogies in genre theory by David Fischelhoff, he explores the connections between literal reality and genre theory, explaining that the metaphor genres are social institutions is commonly used by literary scholars to describe how literary genres coordinate textual relations, organization, and change. As for example, a professor is expected to comply with certain patterns of action and to interact with other role players, e.g. students, according to the structure and functions of an educational institution. The setup in 1949 is based on a poem by Joseph March. It is shot in real time and is a classic example of a film noir. It is a totally absorbing movie, considered by many to be one of the most realistic and gripping films ever made. Martin Scorsese says that the setup inspired many elements in The Raging Bull. I will be looking at boxing genre. 3 periods of intense activity mark the development of the boxing film genre: 1930 to 1942, 1946 to 56, and 1975 to 1980.
Sit down. Sit down. Mom, can you hear me? Mom, where are you? Where are you?
I'm in Pittsburgh. It's raining.
Mom, you're in New York, St. Christopher's Arena. New York.
The boxing film genre may be further divided into 6 cycles and 3 clusters. These 6 cycles are the Depression cycle, the Popular Front cycle, the Noir cycle, the After the Ring cycle, the Racial and Ethical Prejudice cycle, the Failed Hybrids cluster, the Comeback cycle, the African American Documentary cluster, and the Masculinity Crisis Postmodern cluster of 1993 to 2005. Films advertising to the public in posters or in shows show a clear image of the narrative. Reviews show its generic framework. Posters advertise the comedy of the year, clearly telling the viewer the film's genre. It is this that raises the public's expectations through the means of media, a method Ellis calls intertextual relay. As any business, it wants to draw its target audience in, and the film industry is no different. By advertising a narrative, and in some cases even telling us the genre it sells that film instantly. Continuing on from the Soviet-style montage, the dominant style of editing practiced during the classical Hollywood period was sometimes called invisible editing, because the edit points are so recessive and so determined by the imperative of seamless continuity that the viewer cannot see them. Hollywood-style editing carefully matches inserts and close-ups to the physical relations of characters and objects, as seen in the 180-degree rule, keeping the camera setups on one side of the action line so that the right-left coordinates of the screen geography remain consistent across shot changes. Cut points typically follow the flow of dialogue, and shot-reverse shot editing uses the eye-line match to connect characters who are otherwise shown separately in close-ups. This style of editing assured the utmost clarity about the geography of the screen world, and the communication of essential story information. For these reasons, it is sometimes called point-of-view editing or continuity editing. That it became the standard editing style of Hollywood system is evident in the fact that it can be found in films across genres, directors, and studios. In the late 50s and early 60s, films of the French New Wave introduced a more aggressive editing style than was typical of the Hollywood studios. Breathless in 1960 by Jean-Luc Godard used jump cuts that left out parts of the action to produce discontinuities between shots, and American directors a decade later assimilated this approach in pictures such as Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider. As a result, by the 1970s, the highly regulated point-of-view editing used in classical Hollywood began to break down as an industry standard, and the cutting style of American films became more eclectic, exhibiting a mixture of classical continuity and more of a collage-like editing styles, such as we see with Scorsese. This was the beginning of what is termed the MTV style of editing, where, as mentioned earlier, shots were reduced from 5 to 8 seconds to 3 to 4 seconds. The jump cut. An abrupt edit cutting from one shot to a similar shot where the subject is moved forward in time. The background may change or the subject may change, and this creates a sentence of omission in a continuous shot, where there is a sense of discontinuity or acceleration of time. A match cut. In a match cut with a familiar relationship between two different shots, takes place with continuity of place and direction, completed with action, and a similar center of attention in the frame. It can be composed. There are three types of match cuts. There's a graphic match cut, where shapes and imagery are matched. There are movement match cuts, where movement is simulated and matched. There are audio match cuts, where sounds are matched. Cutaway. Shows an action but then cuts away to a similar but different clip, and then back to the original action, although it shows that there has been a progression. Action cut. Cutting on the action. It cuts from one shot to another view, the second shot, that matches the first shot's action. Usually this is called cutting on the camera action, and we see this in the Birdman. Cuts. There are three types of transitions between film clips. Example 1, fade in, out. 2, dissolve. And 3, basic hard cut. Time can be also displaced during a dissolve. And now we're going to look at an editor complete and execute a J cut.
Neighborhood's changing like crazy.
So now here, I want to hear him earlier. I want to hear him around about here. I'm just going to make this a little less loud.
Neighborhood's changing like crazy.
And this concludes my video essay. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it. I will now run the opening scene for The Sound of Music by Rodgers and Hammerstein.
With songs they have sung for 1,000 years. The hills fill my heart with the sound of music. My heart wants to sing every song it hears. My heart wants to beat like the wings of the birds that rise from the lake to the trees. My heart wants to sigh like a chime that flies from a church on a breeze. To laugh like a brook when it trips and falls over stones on its way. To sing through the night like a lark who is learning to pray. I go to the hills when my heart is lonely. I know I will hear what I've heard before.